So welcome, Dr. Ali Chappell. Thank you for meeting with me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and how I found you, just for the audience to know, is I was on a very popular Instagram account about glucose regulation. We may not mention the name, and that shows a lot of continuous glucose monitoring. And one of the things that it highlighted was if you combine, like if you eat hummus, if you combine chickpeas with fat, you get less of a glucose spike. And my attention was drawn to your comment. And you had a very thorough, very interesting comment about how I know partly why that glucose spike is reduced is because when you combine starches and fats together, you get this big insulin spike, which is lowering your glucose. And as a naturopathic doctor, I think, we pay a lot of attention to insulin resistance. We pay a lot of attention to blood sugar, glucose, metabolic health. But there's something about how the medical community and even naturopathic doctors tend to frame everything about glucose, and this is a very popular Instagram account. Everyone loves it. It's like all about how to lower your glucose. And we forget that it's actually insulin that we're trying to regulate. And so then I started following you, read your book, read your research. And so I'm like, really excited to have you on. And,
It's my favorite topic.
yeah.
I it Sometimes I get a little frustrated when I scroll through Instagram because it is this very glucose-centric, but that's not just Instagram, that's the medical community as well. So
Like,
I think we're turning a page, and I think we're moving in the right direction from a medical perspective, but we're not there yet completely.
yeah, like we're hearing the word insulin mentioned more, but it's still all about glucose. And so maybe we can start by you explaining a little bit about, blood sugar, insulin resistance, and insulin, and I mean, I told you in the email and in our communication that my audience they have a bit of a background about insulin resistance, but it's always helpful to hear it again. And also for newcomers that are just joining, it would be helpful for them to hear a bit of an explanation.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll start with how did I even get into this, right? And where did Um, I have PCOS. I started having symptoms at 14, just a lot of weight gain and acne. And at 21, and I had one period a year. And at 21, I was studying to be a dietitian, never heard of PCOS. I went to the on-campus clinic, and a women's health nurse practitioner diagnosed me and basically said, well, you need to lose weight, which every dietitian loves to hear. Um, and that, I need to watch my weight, and, here's a brochure and a pat on the back, and here's some birth control pills. And that was it. And I was like, how does my diet and my ovaries have anything to do with each other? Like, I literally am about to graduate with a bachelor's in nutrition. I've never heard of PCOS. So that really where I started researching this, and was like, it has all to do with insulin resistance. And at that point, the only thing I knew about insulin was you give it to diabetics to lower their blood sugar. Like, that was all I knew. So it was understanding really how insulin is the driving factor of PCOS. So then I thought, okay, well, what raises your insulin levels? And that really led me down this journey of, well, okay, so there are certain foods that raise insulin, even if they don't raise blood glucose. And what does that mean? And what are those foods? And that is really what started this journey. So, I incorporated this kind of what low insulin diet, although I just don't like the word diet. It's kind of a four-letter word.
Mm.
Especially because I struggled with binge eating for so long because of PCOS and because I couldn't lose weight. So I called it a low insulin lifestyle. And that really started the journey. It worked, it was amazing results for myself, with acne and, helping me lose weight. And so that's when my PhD advisor was like, well, why don't you just do a study and see if it works for other people? And so, I was very lucky. I got a grant from the Laura W. Bush Institute for Women's Health Research, a prestigious research scholar grant for $25,000, which allowed me to kind of start the study. And that really, the results were better than I could have expected. I was working with a reproductive endocrinologist, and she was sending me all of her patients. And so that really led down this journey. And so now we've done 3 studies now, a randomized control trial. And so that is kind of what's launched this whole low insulin lifestyle and all the data to support it. But, I think when you start with understanding that over the past several decades, more than that probably, the medical establishment focuses on glucose, and they don't really care about how you lower glucose. They just want glucose within a normal range. And so that has led to the development of many, many drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, that stimulate the pancreas to make more insulin, right? In an effort to lower blood glucose. And once that patient's glucose is in the normal range, they get a green check and they're off on their way and they're healthy. But the problem with that is that so many people, their pancreas is just overworking so hard to keep that blood glucose in the normal range. Like there's a class of medications I'm sure you're familiar with called sulfonylureas, and they stimulate the pancreas to make insulin. And yes, the glucose levels normalize, but the long-term side effects of these medications are pancreatic cancer and worsened insulin resistance, because when you're raising insulin levels in the blood, you're going to have worse health outcomes. And so we're now beginning to realize that it wasn't ever the glucose that was the problem. It's always been the insulin. And so I try to explain it as, imagine you hire somebody to fix your foundation of your home. And they come in and all they do is patch the cracks in the wall, right? And they fix the cracks. So you don't see the foundation, the cracks anymore. And they're like, all right, it's fixed. And you're like, but did you really fix it? Or did you just fix the symptom? Because that's the problem. Glucose imbalance is a symptom of an insulin problem. And so I think now, finally, we're starting to really turn the page and say, well, if I'm not measuring insulin, then how do you really have the full picture of what's going on in the background to make that blood sugar go up? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's infuriating, as you said. I mean, people will have all the symptoms, which I'm sure we'll talk about, of high insulin resistance, but their blood sugar will be normal, even ideal. Their HbA1c will be ideal. And then it's like, okay. So often what I have to do when people bring in blood work, if we're not ordering it ourselves, is like kind of look peripherally at the signs and symptoms. Like, oh, you have high triglycerides, you have low HDL, oh, you've noticed weight gain, you're not sleeping. So it's looking at kind of all around it when we could just directly measure insulin. It's not very expensive.
It's not, but there's some problems with that. So historically, it was using what are called immunoassays, which are not always very consistent. But now we're using mass spectrometry, which is very consistent, very accurate. So a lot of the providers and the reason that measuring insulin isn't in standard practice guidelines is because they say that the results are not necessarily always accurate, and so they don't want to test that. That's not true anymore, right? We have devices that can measure hormones in urine using your phone, and you're telling it we can measure insulin accurately in the blood. Mm-hmm. The second problem is that we haven't developed standard normal ranges. Okay, so if you go and get your insulin tested today, whether it's through Quest or wherever, all of them are going to have a different range of normal, and they're all wildly inaccurate. So they'll say that anything between 3 and 30 microunits per milliliter are normal. Like anything over 8 is considered to be too high. And some even say even above 6 is too high, but 8 is a more well accepted. They've done some studies looking at this, and over 8 really is where it sets you up for problems. So for somebody, I've had plenty of people say, well, I have all these symptoms, but I'm not insulin resistant. And I'll say, well, did you get your insulin tested? And they said, yeah, it was 22. I'm like, well, that's 3 times higher than it needs to be, but we don't have the standard normal ranges. So until we have mass awareness that testing insulin is important, normal ranges so that people actually know what is and is not considered a problem, then I think and also just the general education of the healthcare community that measuring insulin is the other part of the conversation, and even a bigger and more important part than just glucose. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, people are just walking into a house and assessing the foundation by whether or not there's cracks in the walls, and that's just not how you do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, knowing how to treat it, right? Because a lot of people, and also for the Canadians, 8 is about 42 or 50 in the standard units. So people are looking at their blood work being like, but still, the ranges in the SI units go up to 300, and I have seen people over that range, but not commonly. But often people will have a HOMA IR value that is abnormal. So it's a little bit more nuanced and helpful, which is a calculation you do with fasting glucose, fasting insulin. But another part is just knowing how to treat it, because people are told like, well, you're already eating well, very general term, and moving. So let's just watch and wait until you have type 2 diabetes, and then we'll give you drugs for it, basically.
That's absolutely what's happening. And that's where really the issue is. And what I'm trying to do is that the standard nutrition recommendations don't really work for insulin resistance because they're not focused on minimizing insulin spikes. So I always like to use this like an orange with thumbtacks. I don't know if you saw that post on my profile.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah,
I use that a lot.
I thought of stealing your idea for my course I'm doing. It's a great visual.
Please do. The more the education gets out there, the better. So, I kind of show this orange with these thumbtacks, and I say, well, this is a cell, and these thumbtacks are your insulin receptors. And when you eat foods that spike insulin, and I'm going to say insulin, not glucose, although sometimes they're together and sometimes they're not, but we'll talk about that later, is that when you eat foods that cause these insulin spikes, those receptors become overwhelmed with all the insulin in circulation, and they start basically saying, whoa, I'm overwhelmed. I'm going to start removing these receptors from my surface. And when that happens, there are fewer receptors where insulin can bind and pull glucose in, because the only way to get glucose out of the blood is to have insulin bind to a receptor, and it pulls the glucose into the cell. Well, if you have less receptors, then you have less ability to get glucose from the blood. Well, pancreas then says, hey, wait, there's too much sugar in the blood. We can't have all this sugar in the blood. So it sends out more insulin. And that kind of starts this vicious cycle. So now you've got the pancreas compensating for these reduced number of receptors, which then makes more receptors disappear. And here you are eating every 2 hours foods that are causing more insulin spikes. And it really causes this huge vicious cycle, because more insulin in the blood means more of the food you're eating is going to be stored as fat as compared to used. And it also means your metabolism is going to slow, because your brain says, whoa, my cells are starving. Where can we don't get enough glucose. I don't know where my next meal's coming. I'm going to slow everything down so that we don't have to start burning muscle for energy. And that's when you go take naps. And that's when you have chronic fatigue. So all of it really starts with what you're eating and whether it's spiking your insulin, because that is the stimulus that gets the snowball rolling. And then, at that point, the problem that most people find is that they will have all these symptoms. And like you said, their glucose will be normal because your pancreas is still able to secrete enough insulin. It just can't get the job done. It can keep the blood glucose level stable for long enough, but eventually it starts to get out of hand. I think of the I Love Lucy episode. I'm dating myself. But, when they're in the chocolate factory and they're like, oh, this is okay. We're good. And then the machine starts going and they're like, whoa, I can't keep up. That's basically your blood sugar, essentially, where it starts to get too out of control and they no longer can get it managed. The pancreas can't manage it. So I hope that I like to give these visuals so that we understand what's happening below the surface.
Yeah, I often use the beach ball. It's okay, your beach ball, you're pushing it down, but the more buoyant it is, the harder you have to push. So the amount of insulin is telling us how hard basically is your pancreas working to keep your blood sugar where it is. So your HbA1c is, let's say, 5%, or your fasting glucose is 5. These are the Canadian units, which is normal, which is ideal. But there's two people with the same blood sugar. One may have really high insulin pressing down on that fasting glucose, and someone else may have low insulin. So their cells are a lot more sensitive. And so it's only when you can no longer suppress it, then you start to see rises in blood sugar. And then you start to, have your doctor call you in to say, hey, you've pre-diabetes,
Yes. I think that's the other thing. I wish that the diabetes community would come up with different terms for the different types of type 2 diabetes, right? Because if you're just measuring a glucose, well, you don't know if that person's making so much insulin, it's just not working very well, or if their pancreas is, I call a lazy pancreas, if you saw in my book, right? Or they have a lazy pancreas. So I think there's quite a bit of people now talking about these very thin people who say, I've always struggled to gain weight. I've never had to struggle with my weight, but now I'm pre-diabetic. What's going on? Well, and that also is and I talked about how you can't look at other people and say, well, look, Asian people eat all this rice and they're very skinny, and how can they get away with it? It must be good for you. Oh, they have a very different metabolism. They can't make enough insulin, right? They're not going to gain weight no matter what they do. So, it's just it's like we need a type 2A and a type 2B.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it should be called different things ultimately, because yeah. I mean, one of the things I was seeing in practice, not so often, but my type 2 diabetic patients were being prescribed insulin, which is wild, right? Because you're getting more of the thing that's driving the disease process. Is very short-term, short-sighted thinking based on a paradigm that's not, the whole paradigm is shifted off of what's actually true, which is weird because it's not that hard to just shift it. Yeah, to more accurate, which is what you're doing.
And even if let's say you have a lazy pancreas, right? You can't make enough insulin to keep up with the food that you're eating. Giving them a medication like a sulfonylurea to just force that poor little overworked, pancreas to make even more insulin is like kicking a dog while it's down. Like it can't keep up. And now you're going to force it to make more. And all that's doing is going to lead to beta cell failure. And then they are going to have to take insulin because their pancreas is going to be so worn out, it can't function anymore. And that does happen to the other group too, right? I mean, eventually their pancreas is like, I'm retiring. I'm done. I've been overworked for so many years. I'm just done. And then they become, I wish that we could get to a point where diabetes management is insulin management and not glucose management. But there's just a lot of education that would have to be done, I think.
Yeah. And I think, you were coming at it from your own experience, which is having PCOS, which for anyone listening, if you don't know, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a condition of insulin resistance. But it's often not framed that way or treated that way. I mean, one of the therapies is metformin, which is a diabetes drug. But, people are also prescribed like testosterone blockers, and anti-androgens and birth control to regulate the period, which, but yeah, and I think, a lot of conditions that are not being flagged as being insulin resistant conditions, and again, this is kind of more of that same problem. And how insulin resistance can affect, aside from sort of diabetes, it has all of these other symptoms in the body, potentially Alzheimer's, weight gain, and these changes in menopause and perimenopause that can increase insulin levels, that can contribute to all these symptoms that people notice. Like I'm having difficulty sleeping, I'm irritable, I'm noticing all this weight gain and I haven't changed my diet or I haven't changed my exercise, and all these really frustrating symptoms that people are just left to deal with on their own. And they're told to exercise and diet more, which is difficult because, as you mentioned, you're fatigued, you have all these cravings, your blood sugar's cycling, your insulin is spiking, and it's making you starving and tired. And so, yeah, we're sort of missing a huge opportunity to treat people.
If, first of all, insulin resistance affects 89% of U.S. adults, but just as many, abroad as well as children. Insulin resistance really starts in the womb. So before a mom even gets pregnant, they've done studies where they can take insulin in a mom before she even conceives, and it will predict whether her female child would have early puberty. Because when they are have too much insulin over the course of pregnancy, and pregnancy is a natural state of insulin resistance because insulin resistance helps you store fat and it helps you grow. And so insulin resistance is super important in pregnancy. But if you already had too high before you even got pregnant, then you're even higher. And that leads to the baby to have genetic changes that leads them to oversecrete insulin. And your breast milk, because milk has insulin in it, it's what helps cause insulin resistance in a newborn baby, because insulin resistance is important in newborn babies because what are they doing? They're growing and they're storing fat. So that breast milk is helping do that because their pancreas isn't advanced or mature enough to make enough insulin. So they're getting their insulin from the breast milk, which happens from cow's milk too. We can talk about that later. So, they've even looked at moms who have high insulin levels. Their breast milk has higher insulin levels, which means that baby's getting more insulin from the mom. And that leads them to this spiral. So when we look at all these intervention programs for young kids who are overweight and obese, the intervention is like almost too late by that point. The intervention needs to start in the reproductive age women to get them as healthy as possible before they even have a baby. But, I say all that to say, there could be nothing more important than insulin management. Because like you said, especially menopause is the same thing. It's this very, I wouldn't say natural phase of insulin resistance, but it is. I mean, when estrogen drops, insulin rises, and they start having all these symptoms, including cardiovascular disease. That's why heart disease risk increases after menopause. So, and it's definitely something that we're missing for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also in my course talk a lot about these sort of vicious cycles of inflammation driving insulin resistance and vice versa. And then you mentioned like muscle breakdown in order to get glucose levels normalized, which, reduces some of our insulin sensitizing capacity because we have less muscle. And so there's all these, stress and how that affects our blood sugar and how that affects our insulin. And so we're kind of caught in these like snowballs. And which also resists kind of very basic treatment recommendations like, oh, just eat less, exercise more, right?
Exercise more.
Yeah, exactly.
So, that kind of goes back to this journey and what I just realized and what I understood about what foods really spike insulin. So I think, I can get wrapped up in how bad insulin is and what it causes and all these things. And people are sometimes like, okay, I get it, but like, what do I do? So, the thing about insulin is that first, what we've been teaching for nutrition perspective, all through my dietetic education and everything was more whole grains, more beans, less meat, more low-fat dairy. That's been pretty much the advice that we've been given. And the problem with that is that, when you look at whole grains and beans and sweet potatoes, they're all starches. Right. And starch is the only carbohydrate source that is pure glucose. Now, of course, those foods give you protein and fiber and vitamins and minerals, but they also give you lots of starch. I mean, a third of a cup of quinoa is 36 grams of starch. That's a lot of starch. Well, the problem with that is because starch is essentially just made up of pure glucose. Pure glucose chains, that's what starch is. So when you eat that and you break all those glucose molecules up, all that is doing is causing a huge insulin spike. So when people say, well, we should be able to have some starch, well, it's not that this is an everything. It's like telling somebody with a peanut allergy that they should be eating peanuts because they're healthy for them. When you're insulin resistant, it means you're glucose intolerant. That is essentially the medical term. You are glucose intolerant. That's why we give them glucose tolerance tests. And if you fail that, which most people do, it means you're glucose intolerant. So the last thing you want to be doing is eating sources of pure glucose, right? That's not going to really help you towards your goal. So when you think about carbohydrates, it's not about limiting your total carbohydrates or having to count them. It's simply getting them for foods that are lower in glucose, which are non-starchy vegetables and whole raw fruit, versus starches. And the other thing is that, yes, those foods give you fiber and protein and vitamins and minerals, but you can get all of those same vitamins, minerals, protein, fiber in more insulin-friendly options. So that's one component that's kind of against conventional nutrition recommendations. That's part of a low insulin lifestyle is limit the starches as much as you can. Eat as many carbs as you want, just from fruits and veggies. The second is around dairy. So remember, breast milk, the purpose of breast milk is to provide insulin and insulin growth factor. Insulin growth factor is this very, very potent growth hormone. In infancy, it's so important. It's what helps babies double their length and triple their weight in the first year. It's the most rapid time of growth. I mean, just look at the clothing sizes. Anybody who has had a baby sees that these babies are growing. But adults, or really even after infancy, we're not growing really that much. The next time that IGF-1 or insulin growth factor levels increases again is during puberty. when we're growing. You don't want insulin growth factor, IGF. You don't want IGF levels to be high throughout the lifespan because IGF-1 is the strongest predictor of cancer risk because cancer at its most basic is an overgrowth of cells, right? And so that's just a growth hormone that's telling your cells to grow. So milk provides both insulin and insulin growth factor. And cow's milk provides even more than human milk because look at how much a cow has to grow. So from a milk perspective, milk is very, very insulin spiking because you're essentially just drinking insulin. Okay. Now, the second component of dairy that's very insulin spiking are the proteins in milk. So the proteins in milk are whey and casein. They have a very unique amino acid profile. They're the most concentrated sources of branched chain amino acids, which are essential. You need them to build muscle. You don't need to overdo them because overdoing branched chain amino acids causes excessive insulin secretion. And there's tons of research looking at branched chain amino acids and type 2 diabetes. So, that really begs this question of, well, we have whey protein in everything. I mean, one walk down the...
So popular, protein cereal, protein bread. Yeah.
It is in everything. And the reason it's in everything is because it's a waste product from the dairy industry. To make 1 pound of cheese, it makes 9 pounds of whey waste, and they didn't know what to do with it all. So in the 70s and 80s, somebody was like, oh, let's powder this and dry it, and we'll aggressively market it to the fitness industry. And, it'll be a high protein. We'll market it as protein and put it in everything because it's a waste product. And they were not allowed from the Environmental Protection Agency, if that still exists. They're not allowed to pour it down the rivers because it killed all the fish because it causes algae bloom. So they literally didn't have anything to do with it. And so they started marketing it to people. And it's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. So now you look at anything and everything, and it has whey protein in it, not because it's healthy, but because it's very abundant, if you can imagine.
I'm so guilty of recommending it. And there's also this conflicting, I think you made a good point about how it's not like people get confused and they get wrapped up in emotional. And so for anyone listening, it's not about like it's not about like quinoa being bad. It's about what your underlying health concerns and health goals are and whether it's like glucose, you're not glucose tolerant, just like someone who can't consume peanuts. They're not peanut tolerant, they have peanut allergy, but it's right? And so when we hear of like branched chain amino acids and whey protein stimulating protein muscle synthesis, it's like, okay, that is appropriate for that context maybe. But if we look at the context of someone who's insulin resistant, you don't need to be spiking your insulin, and this could be working against you. And this is what I was on a keto diet, which we'll probably talk about. And I was like, why am I not really getting that great results? Well, I was mixing my whey protein into some yogurt, high-fat yogurt, natural yogurt. And I was like, when I read your stuff, I was like, oh, okay, that's why I'm starving after I have this.
Well, and let's go back to, because I do get a lot of criticism when I make posts about whey protein from the bodybuilding community.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's talk about why is it effective for stimulating muscle growth?
Mm-hmm.
Because it spikes insulin and it spikes insulin growth factor. And those are growth hormones. I mean, they're not that different than anabolic steroids. An anabolic steroid means growth hormone. And insulin and IGF-1, especially IGF-1, is a growth hormone. So if you're eating things, I mean, there are some bodybuilders who are just injecting IGF-1. Like that's now part of the doping, like where the Olympic Association is now measuring blood levels of IGF-1 to determine whether people are doping. That's how strong of a growth hormone it is. For somebody who's like taking a walk around the block and then coming home for a whey protein shake is not only counterproductive, but possibly worsening. And so that's the thing is you're going to the grocery store and you're buying these protein pancakes thinking, well, there must be better than regular pancakes. And actually they're worse because it's the same processed flour, but now you have processed flour with whey protein in it. And that manufacturer of those protein pancakes paid nothing for that whey protein because it was just a waste product. And they're charging you more for it because you think it's healthier because it says high protein. I mean, it's just, and even then, even if you're not buying the protein pancakes, it's everything. I love Birch Bender's pancake mix, the keto pancake mix. Well, they recently reformulated their recipe to add whey protein in it, but it's not high protein. It's not a high protein food. They added whey protein as an additive for who knows what. So it's literally in everything. And it's like, why would, to think about it, even in 1 cup of milk, right? If you just get a cup of milk, 20% of the protein in a cup of milk comes from whey. Only 20%, which is probably biologically being like, well, we want these babies to grow, but like, let's keep it kind of regulated, right? Let's not make the whole thing just this huge insulin spike. But yet now we're concentrating it and adding multiple scoops to a protein shake and having way more branched chain amino acids and insulin spike than nature ever intended. And it's scary. So, that's kind of the whole thing about dairy. But I'm not dairy free because, and I'm sorry, you had a question.
No, go ahead. No, I think, well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm not dairy free. You would think, well, obviously she doesn't eat dairy. No, because fermented dairy, when you think about Greek yogurt and cheese, to make Greek yogurt and cheese, you have to remove all the whey. Okay, that's why Greek yogurt is very thick compared to other types of yogurt. Skyr is very thick compared to other like regular Yoplait yogurt or whatever at the store. It's kind of runny. That's because it still has a lot of whey in it. Same thing with cottage cheese. It has a lot of whey in it because whey is liquid. But Greek yogurt and cheese, the way to make those is to completely remove the whey. So you're just left with casein. Now, casein still raises insulin and insulin growth factor, but when you ferment those, the bacteria changes those branched chain amino acids to branched chain keto acids. It changes the actual structure of those branched chain amino acids, which lowers that insulin response. So when you look at these studies that look at dairy and health, they all will say, well, yogurt's still good for you. And people see a benefit because you have the probiotics from the fermentation, but you also have fundamentally changed the insulin component, the insulin spiking component of that casein. So you have a much more insulin friendly product. So I still, so it's Greek yogurt and I recommend full fat because if you take out the fat, what are you concentrating? The protein.
And the sugar.
Protein is, yeah. So you want the fat in there because you don't want so many dairy proteins. Dairy proteins, their biological purpose is to stimulate insulin. So I still recommend that if they're gonna, for a low insulin lifestyle, we recommend getting rid of all dairy except full fat Greek yogurt and cheese, aged cheese.
Yeah, which is great because it still gives you, because like you said, there's a lot of studies where it's like, yogurt can reduce belly fat. So it can be confusing for people when they hear. But I was going to say, when you were talking about whey protein as, and the insulinemic, whatever you say, effects, if you are monitoring your glucose with a continuous glucose monitor, adding whey protein will probably lower your glucose.
Yeah. And so that's another thing. It's so funny. I get these people that are like, you don't know what you're talking about. I wear a continuous glucose monitor and it doesn't spike my glucose. I'm like, I didn't say it spiked glucose. Whey has no glucose in it. It's not going to affect your glucose. It's going to drive insulin. Mm-hmm. But, one of the things that protein also does naturally is it also, this might be too sciencey and we don't even have to get into that, but
go for it.
You have glucagon also, right? So you have insulin and glucagon. And when glucagon rises, it releases glucose from the liver. And so they'll say, oh, well, it increases glucagon, which makes people more full for longer. And that's all true. But the reason it stimulates glucagon is because if it doesn't, a person's going to be hypoglycemic. It has to have that glucagon release the glucose into the bloodstream so that it doesn't overcompensate and drive the blood sugar down too low. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So you have a net neutral of glucose because you're releasing more glucose into the bloodstream from the liver, but you're also blocking, pushing glucose down lower because you're trying to drive it into those cells. That's why it's great for muscle building. But whey protein after a workout, yes, you need insulin to drive muscle growth and get those amino acids into the cells to build. But that's like whey protein is like starting a fire and throwing gasoline on it. Like you can start a fire without gasoline. Yeah, it may be faster with gasoline, but you're going to cause potentially a lot more problems than you intended by doing that. So, yeah, definitely, if people want to have a protein powder, I recommend foods with a much more balanced amino acid profile, like egg white protein is great. My husband loves J-Rob. We're not affiliated. That just seems to be a really good one. J-Rob egg white protein is good. Bone broth protein powder is also a good one. Or if they're plant-based, hemp seed protein is a good one as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's good. What about pea proteins? People ask me this all the time. So often they'll remove the starch, although peas would naturally have starch. But do you know about the branching amino acid?
Well, they are not going to have many. They do have some. So they are like a complete protein, although that's not even necessary. Like you don't have to have every single protein source have to be a complete protein every time. As long as you're eating a variety of protein foods, you're going to get all you need. So when people say, well, bone broth protein is not a complete protein, you're going to be fine. But with pea protein and rice protein, brown rice protein, yes, they do remove the starch. So from an insulin spiking perspective, it's better. It's okay. It's just that they're very processed, right? They go through a very extensive processing to remove all that starch so that you can get that concentrated protein. Whereas like hemp seed protein is just hemp seeds, right? Now it does taste like the inside of a lawnmower, so you better like that earthy taste.
It's pretty rough, but they can doctor it up and make it taste pretty good.
Or you can just sprinkle hemp seeds into your smoothie and they don't have a taste at all. But the same thing with like now they're coming out with these new protein powders like almond protein powder and pumpkin seed protein powder.
Yeah.
They're just processed to remove all the extra fat, which you should be getting anyways because fat is good for us, but it concentrates the protein because everybody is so obsessed with getting more protein. But I'd like to challenge that a lot of that came from the marketing of the whey protein powder industry.
That's interesting.
To make people think they needed 200 grams of protein a day.
Yeah, I mean, well, and also, and I'm definitely guilty of pushing the protein thing, but when people have high insulin, like generally just high fasting insulin, I mean, you're already kind of set up to technically
to build muscle.
Yeah. So I'll often
That's a big complaint.
Yeah.
For PCOS.
People like, I easily put on muscle. I just can't lose weight. It's like, well, okay, then you don't need whey, maybe.
No, you definitely don't need whey. I hope that I don't ever sound like I don't think protein is important. Protein is absolutely important. I do not track protein at all. I did track one day just to see like, what do I get? I'm curious, and I had about 95 grams of protein. And that's like from peanut butter. I love shelled edamame. And like, for lunch, I eat a pound of frozen vegetables that I put in a pan and I cook it in some avocado oil and I throw shelled edamame, like a half cup of shelled edamame, and I sprinkle some grated Parmesan cheese and some toasted pecan. And it's like this big and I will eat the whole bowl. And it's like 30 plus grams of protein just for that. You don't really need to track it as long as you're being mindful that at every meal you're having fruits and veggies, you're having something protein, and you're having some fat, you're going to be fine. I think this idea of these excessive protein goals came from the fact that the only way you can meet that goal is by using protein powder, which then plays into the industry,
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into this, but I think I was going through one of the studies where it showed sort of the macronutrient results because they had people do diet diaries. You had people do diet diaries a couple times during the 2 months. And yeah, they were eating about 90 grams a day, which is a lot of people struggle to get that much. And I wonder if maybe there's something about kind of removing the food noise by having like, okay, here's the foods that you're eating. And, a huge chunk of that is protein foods. Maybe there's something about how starch kind of changes our appetite or our satiety. So we're not really interested in protein. But yeah, it's interesting that we're just kind of falling into it,
These were patients who were, very overweight. Their average fasting insulin was 31. Now remember, it needs to be 8. So their average fasting is 8 or less. Their average fasting insulin was 31. And their A1C was 5.2 or 5.3, like totally normal. If they went to the store, to the doctor would be like, "You're healthy as a horse. I don't know why you're having all these symptoms. Come back when you're
crazy." Yeah.
right? That basically what they'd be told.
Mhm.
And behind the scenes, their insulin is 3 or 4 times higher than it needs to be. And we basically said, okay, well, you're going to follow this plan. You're going to eat as much as you want, whenever you want, at these foods that don't spike insulin, non-starchy vegetables, whole fruits, lean proteins. We didn't even stress the lean on the protein, but we were like, just trim visible fat. By no means do you need to eat egg whites, like eat the eggs, make sure you're getting lots of healthy fats. I even was encouraging them. I was like, I want you to eat a whole medium avocado every day. Like, I want you to make that a goal. And that was it, right? And we told them, you're going to, first 8 weeks, we want you to not eat anything on this list of insulin spiking foods. Also, you can have either Greek yogurt or cheese, but only 1 serving a day. And you could have red wine if you want it, because it's a sustainability. Am I saying red wine is a health food? No, but it is part of like just having something that's sustainable that you can have as a treat, and they could have an ounce of dark chocolate. And what's really important is we didn't allow them to exercise. And not the exercise is, of course, important, and we recommend exercise. For a clinical research study, you have to make sure that the results they're seeing are from the diet changes and not the exercise. So they couldn't exercise. And that was it. And 2 months later, they lost 19 pounds. They had a 50% reduction in insulin. They had a 50+% reduction in HOMA-IR. They had a 35% drop in triglycerides. I mean, 2 months. Their testosterone levels went down by 25% because they had PCOS. I mean, it was crazy. With the results, and those results have been extended to all of the studies that we've done. And what was great was that they did these diaries. And so for whoever's listening who hasn't read the studies, their average calorie intake was just around 1,400 or 1,500 a day. I mean, again, not counting calories, eating whatever they wanted. Their carb intake,
as many nuts as you want,
as many nuts, as much fruit, like whatever they
red
wanted.
meat,
red meat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one girl told me, she's like, I ate an entire pack of bacon. I know I wasn't supposed to do that, but I kind of like just binged on a pack of bacon. I'm not saying bacon's healthy. You should not eat bacon. It was uncured bacon, thankfully. But because their body is able to burn that fat, it wasn't just circulating in the blood causing triglycerides, right? And so their fat intake was very high, right? I think they had 70+ grams of fat, which coming from avocados, the actual breakdown was largely monounsaturated. So it was coming from nuts and avocados and oils and whatnot. So, that's the thing is when people get their appetite hormones more regular or regulated, they just don't feel as hungry. I mean, that is one of the most common and the very first testimonials that people tell me is when I take an insulin first approach, not glucose, not calories, not protein. When I take an insulin first approach and insulin levels lower, your appetite hormones regulate, and they're like, I'm just not hungry. Like, I can't believe that I have no cravings for anything. Like, I'm just content and satisfied. It's like, because your body can access your stored body fat now. And it doesn't need to force you to eat all the time, because prior it was like, okay, you have a lot of fat in here, but like, I can't use it. So I need you to keep eating because that's the only thing I can use for energy. And now it can tap into that fat stores. And so it's like, oh, I'm good. You can eat if you want, but like, I'm good.
Yeah.
That's essentially what your brain is saying.
Yeah. I remember reading that, thinking the 1,400, I was like, wow, because you're eating ad libitum, which means just whatever you want. Like, you can eat as much of all of those allowed foods. I mean, there's restrictions for the dairy in terms of portions, but nothing else has portion restrictions. And so people are kind of naturally settling into 1,400 calories, which I wonder if, I mean, on a diary day, I probably wouldn't eat my pound of bacon. So it might
Oh, no.
not be,
She didn't report that. That was not on the diary day.
I think that's probably maybe like I'd be on my best behavior. So that might be a little, I don't know if you agree, it might be like lower than the average of what they were eating. But the weight loss, and I know it's not all about weight loss, but I think it's so difficult to lose weight when you're insulin resistant. And a lot of like ketogenic diets and kind of zone diets, I've been looking at a lot of research for a course that I'm producing on insulin resistance. And 19 pounds in 2 months is like amazing.
With no exercise.
With no exercise. And no counting, no tracking, no restriction. They're not restricting. I mean, they're taking out certain foods. So maybe there's an element of, psychological restriction and stuff like that, but you're not hungry is the point,
Yes.
you know?
And did you read our second study was really, not to get too sciencey, but I think it really helps explain this concept is that, we had patients get under this machine and it basically just measures the oxygen and how much you breathe in and out. And it tells you whether you're burning fat or carbs. I know science is cool. So it tells you whether you're burning fat or carbs. Well, these patients were coming in after not eating for 12 hours and they were coming in and they were burning almost no fat. Like even after fasting for all night long, their body still had so much insulin in their system that they couldn't burn their fat. And then after that, we gave them this very high fat shake. It was just basically an Ensure that I added 70 grams of fat to butter, melted
Probably
butter.
delicious. And also, they're probably suffering 12 hours of no eating, and they weren't burning fat.
Well, it was just that they hadn't eaten since 7 p.m. the night before.
Yeah.
They came in the morning. They, we took their at rest to see how much were they burning, how much fat were they actually burning after not eating for 12 hours, which most people should be only burning fat, right? You haven't eaten in a while, like you should be getting your energy from fat stores. None. They drink this high fat shake. Basically shows they stored all that fat from the shake and just burned the little bit of sugar that was in the Ensure. And that was it. All right. After 8 weeks, they come in to do it again, burning almost all fat because now their insulin has dropped after the 8 weeks of following this approach. They're burning almost all fat. They drink the high fat shake, burn almost, their fat burning from that after 5 hours was significantly higher than before. And it just shows why you go tell a patient with insulin resistance that the only way that they're going to reverse insulin resistance is to lose weight and eat less and exercise more and come back, and they're like, I can't even burn fat when I'm eating nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. Like I lived that. That's why I was a binge eater. Like I would eat nothing because I was like, nothing else works. I'll just stop eating. And then you eventually get to a point where you eat everything and then you just have this terrible cycle. And it's so validating. I mean, that study was just so validating to the people who are like, I am doing everything and nothing is working. And then, like just for the randomized control trial, I'll just say it was an independent study, right? Because with research, like you have to have an independent group that can replicate your findings because that's just important. Like I can't run all the studies and be like, this is so great. Somebody else has to do the same thing and see what they find. And they did a randomized control. So half the patients just did general nutrition. They followed the NIH nutrition guidelines, which was more whole grains and beans and more low-fat dairy and eat less and exercise more. And they got put on metformin.
So they also had exercise and they had metformin.
And exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And the other group just followed our plan with no exercise. And this was during COVID. So, I mean, this study started January of 2020. So you've got a lot of cortisol going on. You've got all these things happening. People stuck at home. And the group that followed our plan lost an average of 17 pounds during COVID.
When everyone gained the COVID-19.
When everybody gained weight. So they had, on average, it was between 12 and 17 pounds. And the group on the metformin and eat less and exercise more they gained a third of a pound. And their insulin levels went up. So it was just, yeah. So it really just is continuing to validate this. We're missing the wrong biomarker, right? Insulin is really the only thing that matters and we're just ignoring it. And it's frustrating.
I think too, in that study, if I remember correctly, the control group, so like the high grains group, was also in a calorie deficit. Like they were told to eat 500 calories less. So they were supposed to be losing a pound per week kind of thing. And then they were exercising. So they
like everybody else.
Yeah.
They tried it because they were just standard nutrition advice, that control group. So the group that did the study was a group of reproductive endocrinologists. And they basically said, we just treated them like every other patient we treat. We have a brochure. It talks about, it's just based on like the NIH nutrition information, eat less and exercise more. And if their fasting insulin was too high, which was pretty much everyone, we gave them metformin. And that was like just the standard of care. Like that's what every other patient except for most patients going to fertility clinics are not getting their insulin tested because most fertility specialists don't even understand that that's the reason why these patients aren't getting pregnant. And so, they just submitted the paper for publication. And so hopefully we'll have that data published soon. But it was really great to have a completely independent group
Yeah.
replicate that
So
study
cool.
independently. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. How many studies are there in total? There's 3, I believe. 3.
So 3 actual prospective clinical studies. One of those was a case series because out of the 24 patients in the original study, about 10 of them, not everybody was trying to get pregnant, first of all. Some of these patients were just trying to lose weight or improve their symptoms. But 10 of the patients, even though they, were infertile, they had issues with were getting pregnant, they were seeing a fertility specialist, which should say a lot. They got pregnant very quickly. And we had probably 4 or 5 patients who had to drop out of the study because they got pregnant in the 2-month study. And they actually said the fertility specialist wrote that up as a case series to said, they talked about each patient and was like, this patient been infertile for this time. They've done these different things and essentially showed that the average time to conception in these patients was 86 days after starting this
Wow.
lifestyle change. 86 days.
That's the average. So how
And
could have had sooner? Yeah.
and and it blows my mind. I have a couple friends who have PCOS, and one of them had 5 miscarriages in like an 18-month period, and her doctor would refuse to test her insulin. And he said, your A1C is normal. You don't need to test your insulin. Like, refused. And I mean, it just blows my mind. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, I think there's a lecture that you have on YouTube, where you talk about how high insulin can increase the risk of miscarriage and pregnancy complications. So it's not even just about getting pregnant; it's also what the high insulin does to the health. Yeah.
And that's not even just PCOS.
Hmm.
I mean, there was this really awesome study out of Columbia University, this group that their fertility division and their maternal fetal medicine department that does a lot of research on miscarriage. And this was published in Fertility and Sterility, which is the biggest fertility journal. And what they did is they said, okay, we've been testing glucose and A1C standard when somebody comes in with recurrent miscarriage, which means they've had at least 2 miscarriages within a calendar, 2 repetitive miscarriages. And so they were like, but we're testing their glucose and their A1C and it's normal and it's not necessarily associated with a higher risk of miscarriage. So what they did is they took some of these, they had patients who miscarried and they took some of these early placenta cells. Okay. And they put them in a petri dish and they exposed them to either high levels of glucose or high levels of insulin. What they found was that high glucose levels did absolutely nothing to those early placental cells, nothing. High levels of insulin was as toxic to the developing placenta as chemotherapy drugs.
Wow.
And yet somebody comes in with recurrent miscarriage and we don't even test insulin. We only test glucose. And so that group alone, I mean, they're a huge fertility center at Columbia. And they were like, we're missing the boat. In our clinic, we're going to start testing insulin in every person. So it's just, there are people that are out there talking about it, but it just hasn't made it fully there.
Yeah, it's like it needs to kind of just it's like a Venn diagram where we're not quite focusing in properly on what we should be. Yeah, and so back to the results. I mean, amazing. Like people are getting pregnant, they're losing consistently. Like it's not. I mean, I have a friend who's started your program. She's on like day 5, and she's like giving me a daily update. She's like, "I was so hungry." Now she's like, "I'm not hungry anymore. I feel amazing. I've lost." She's losing like half a pound, like almost a pound a day. It's wild. She's just like dropping. It's just coming off.
It's coming out because your body's like can actually access that stored fat and do what it's supposed to do, which is burn it for energy.
And this is her like trying carnivore and keto just before, and it wasn't really working. And she was like, she's trying to breastfeed. It wasn't, so this is like, she's like mind blown. And so she was telling me to ask you certain things. But I was when I was kind of selling her the protocol, I was like, no, she's legit. She's like, she's repeated these results. It's not just a one-time study where people lost a bunch of weight. Like this is it's a consistent result where people are losing 17 to 19 pounds in 2 months by following this plan. So you don't have like a super loser in your group or something like that that's skewing the results. So pretty miraculous. Like it really is amazing.
Well, so, I don't know if I don't share it too much on my page yet, but I am working with the FDA. So I don't know if you're aware of that. So I've been working with the FDA for the last year. I've met with them 5 times. I have my next meeting with them in a week and a half. Because I'm trying to get this app. So I'm launching an app. So it will officially be launched on May 19th. It is in the app stores right now. Do not download. We're still working on the back end. But we have to we have to get it in the app store, and then we're working on it. So I haven't told anybody it's there. It's there. It's not really functioning yet. So we are officially launching it on May 19th. But one of the things that I'm trying to do is get it FDA cleared as what is called a software as a medical device. People have heard of software as a service, whatever. So now the FDA regulates this type of medical device, which is a software. So apps are considered software as a medical device. So, there's a few that are approved for diabetes, some that are approved for depression. So this would be the very first approved for insulin resistance or PCOS. But, I have to do this big study, right? You have to do a big study to support that clearance. And I have an entire independent group, a different independent group. So I'm very, very proud to say that the PI, or the person who's basically the ringleader of this study, is Dr. Timothy Garvey. He's the director of obesity research at University of Alabama, Birmingham, which is a huge research center. He's an internationally known endocrinologist. So he is taking this study, and I have a dermatologist, a clinical dermatologist at University of Texas. I have a obstetric neurologist who's doing all of the mood evaluation changes after using this. She's at Baylor. I have another dietitian, PhD dietitian, who's out in California. So it's truly independent, right? I don't have anything to do with it. And they're basically where they're having patients use our app. So they'll use the app for 8 weeks, follow the guidance. It has recipes and meal plans and all the things. And after 8 weeks, we test their blood before and after and submit it to the FDA for approval. So we're hoping to have that next year, which would really just be, amazing for patients and amazing to really have this become the standard treatment for insulin resistance, is an insulin first approach.
Yeah, to just have your doctor be able to give you that advice, it'll actually work. So it's motivating. You feel a lot better. You're not as hungry. Even your taste buds change because you're interacting with whole foods that aren't spiking your insulin. So your cravings and your appetite are all regulated and oriented towards what the food that you're getting, as opposed to random. You're not ending up at the bottom of a bag of potato chips because you're blood sugars.
Your brain's I need more glucose and I can't get it and I need you to eat this.
Just and that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that's why, I don't necessarily condemn the use of the GLP-1 drugs, because GLP-1 is an important appetite hormone. And tons of research has shown that when people have high insulin levels, they have lower GLP-1 because insulin is a master hormone. It affects everything, including your appetite hormone. So when insulin is off, your appetite is really unregulated. And the GLP-1 drugs are kind of just bypassing that whole system just to flood the body with GLP-1 so that you don't feel as hungry, which is fine. But the thing is that if you were just to focus on this, you would increase naturally levels of GLP-1 because insulin is suppressing that, So that's where I'm you can do that drug, but you have to realize you're not fixing the problem. And the problem's going to come back. The appetite problem, the weight problem is going to come back until you fix the underlying hormonal cause of why you are hungry all the time in the first place,
Yeah. Because the problem, I think it's a common criticism with those drugs, is that it can be a really important tool. Some people have a lot of weight to lose, it's causing a lot of problems, but if you're just having less Doritos, it's just about appetite suppression and you're not shifting your dietary patterns and you're not kind of using it as an opportunity to learn and to change things, then you're either stuck on them forever, getting nutrient deficient and losing muscle mass, or you're just going to gain the weight back. Yeah. So you have to kind of change things. So why not try the diet first, the exercise first, and then use them as a tool if you have 300 pounds to lose or something. If you have a lot of weight to lose, maybe they could be helpful. But yeah.
That's what Dr. Garvey wants to do, right? He's like, after we do this study, if you would be interested in sponsoring another study to look at patients on GLP-1 drugs who also follow this plan, right? Because taking a GLP-1 drug actually stimulates insulin secretion. And so if you're eating foods causing even more insulin secretion and you're in a calorie deficit because you're not eating as much, you're just eating less of insulin spiking foods, you're actually losing muscle because it goes back to the body not being able to burn fat. And so it needs to make up that calorie deficit somewhere, and it's going to pull from your muscle. So that's really why you're seeing a lot of muscle mass on these drugs. And so he was like, if we could pair something like this with the GLP-1 drugs, then while you're getting your own appetite hormones more regulated, you have this. And then when you come off of it, you don't see such a huge shift in making, wanting to go back to eating all the time because now you've fixed the underlying cause. That is how those GLP-1 drugs should be used. But they're not being used because they're not getting the right information. They're not getting the right education. They're sending them home telling them to eat more whole grains and beans and low-fat dairy. And then they're just in this cycle of bad. And so if we could come out with that data, I think it would be, life-changing, I think.
That'd be really interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see like what people actually. I'm wondering if there's data on like what do people end up eating when they're on a GLP-1? Like, what are their macronutrient spreads? Because people tend to lose appetite for like high fiber foods, protein foods. Like, you don't want satiating foods. You want just kind of easy to absorb, easy to digest. You're nauseous, so you're probably going to go for more starchy foods, I would assume. But
except for now. Everything is like, well, you need to be eating more protein so you don't lose so much muscle mass. It's like the reason they're losing muscle mass is not because they're not drinking whey protein shakes. Like, in fact, that might worsen it. So it's that message. And so now you've got all these food companies that are about to come out with tons of protein rich snacks because they're trying to attach themselves to the people who are taking these drugs who are trying to eat more protein. And those snacks are just the same processed crap with now processed whey protein in it.
I saw that there's
it's scary.
Like big food is trying to design foods that kind of override the natural appetite suppression so that you still stay addicted. So it's like a whole hot mess.
I don't know if it's that or they're just trying to appeal to this new customer who's like, well, I'm not really hungry, but I have to get my protein in. So I'm going to eat this protein Snickers and it's going to be better for me. And so it's just, and it's sad and it's scary. And, that's where we're going because everything you scroll on Instagram one time and all it talks about is if you don't get 50 grams of protein for breakfast, then you can just kiss your biceps goodbye. And it's like,
yeah. But maybe,
I'm not saying protein isn't important. I'm saying you don't need 50 grams.
Maybe. And like if you're, regulating your insulin levels, are you going to be better at using and maintaining your muscle mass and burning fat instead of burning the protein from your muscle to make glucose?
Yes.
Like those people, those sugar burners in the study that you referenced were probably just breaking down their muscle mass.
Yeah, they're breaking down like
shake.
Yes, the amino acids because when you eat protein, your body breaks it down into the amino acids, and then it uses those whatever it needs, right? Whatever amino acid it needs to build whatever that is, whether it's hair, because there's whatever amino acids they need at the time for those things. So there's like an amino acid pool, which is why every single food you eat doesn't have to be a complete protein because it's just getting broken down into these bricks, right? And they're just pulling the bricks as they need them. But that's what's happening is that those sugar burners were essentially just burning yesterday's excess protein that it didn't need, which is a lot of times we're eating more protein than we actually need. Not everybody. Some people are not. But now I feel like people are putting a scoop of whey protein into their Greek yogurt, which is like a lot of protein in one sitting. And it's just breaking that down into those bricks that they can then use for energy if they can't get enough body fat. So that's basically what they were doing because you can break amino acids down into like essentially glucose and just burn that. So metabolism is very complex, right? It can definitely overwhelm people. But I think at the end of the day, if it seems excessive, it probably is. And if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Like going back to the Instagram account on glucose regulation, you know, if you are adding, there's this idea of food combining. If you're going to eat carbs, you need to make sure you add fat or proteins to it, and it will make sure that your glucose doesn't rise too fast. And sure, there are all kinds of beautiful CGM reports that will support this message that as long as you add, butter to your bread, then it will be okay because your glucose doesn't rise. But what that's doing is when you have a lot of fat and a lot of glucose in the bloodstream at one time, I remember my biochemistry teacher in college said, when you have too much fatty acids and too much glucose in the bloodstream at one time, what that does is it's like throwing gum in a lock. Those fatty acids block the insulin from working. So then the pancreas does what? Sends out even more, right? So you have this huge insulin spike happening in the background, which is driving that blood glucose down. So what you see on your CGM is adding butter to my bread stopped that glucose spike. That's so great. But what you don't know in the background is the insulin bomb that happened to keep that glucose level normal. And that's what the problem is. So it's unfortunate because I think now 5 million people think that as long as they add peanut butter to their ice cream or their, whatever, that it's like
I know.
better. But there's
I'm with
is more nuanced than that.
Yeah, like this is why your stuff blew my mind, because I was sort of there is a separate benefit to regulating blood sugar, obviously, but the story is more holistic. It makes more sense in the context of insulin because insulin is damaging. So it's like not about regulating blood sugar at the expense of insulin spikes. So I would recommend to people, okay, you're addicted to donuts and you're going to get a donut nut to put some peanut butter on it to regulate it. And there's a bit of like maybe delayed gastric emptying or delayed release of glucose. But when I saw your comment, I was like, yeah, I knew this from biochemistry, but for some reason didn't put it together. And it may speak to give myself some compassion and credit, may speak to just how we're so not focused on insulin, even in holistic space.
Like you said, there is an aspect of managing glucose. That's true. But if you are managing the insulin, then it's working well. It's working, it's doing what it needs to do. And you don't really need to focus on the glucose. So I have a lot of people say, well, have commented to that post or sent me direct messages that are like, well, so does that mean that I should what if I want to eat gummy bears? Like, is it worse to add almonds to my gummy bears or just eat the gummy bears by themselves? And I said, well, this is actually what you need to realize is that, if you want to eat Oreos, do it infrequently and enjoy them. Mm-hmm. And if you want to dip them in peanut butter, do it because it's delicious. But don't lie to yourself that the peanut butter has somehow made the Oreos better for you, because it didn't. And it actually was probably worse. But it's more about enjoying the foods you want to eat and enjoying them and not feeling like you have to add something to it to make it better, because then you're mentally thinking, well, I can just, I'll eat, whatever. I'll eat the bread because I'll just put the butter on it and it will cancel it out. That is just human nature. And that is what people do because their CGM tells them that that's better. And that's just not the case. And so it's not necessarily that eating it by itself is good by any means, but I don't think anybody needed to tell you that eating gummy bears wasn't good for you, right? Like, I'm trying to tell you that adding almonds doesn't make them better.
Yeah, it's like just let them serve their purpose, which is just
serve their purpose, enjoy them, and try make them as infrequently as possible, because life is meant to be lived. Enjoy the things occasionally, but adding protein and fat, and like you said with the delayed gastric emptying, my challenge to that is ideally what you want is you want insulin to be released after a meal, help bring your blood sugar, and then you want it to come down, right? And you want it to be low, so that between meals, you're pulling fat from your body fat. And then it goes up again after a meal, and then it comes down. And then after dinner and while you're sleeping, it's low. I mean, that's really the ideal. You want it to go up and then back down quickly. When you are adding protein to gummy bears, now you're adding some cheese to gummy bears or something. What that's doing, it is delaying that gastric emptying. But it's not getting rid of the glucose. you're still going to absorb
Hmm.
all the glucose from those gummy bears. But now you're just doing it over time. Well, what does that mean? That means glucose levels are higher in the system for longer and insulin levels are higher in the system for longer, right? Versus just having it go up and then come back down. I'm not saying you should just eat the gummy bears.
Hmm.
You shouldn't eat gummy bears, but if you do, just do it because you like it and try to do it as less frequently as possible. But if you're just eating fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and proteins and all of that, then your insulin would come up moderately, do what it needs to do, and then come back down versus, eating a biscuit with eggs on it. Like, okay, it's not going to have a huge glucose spike, but now you're just going to have glucose higher for longer as it slowly enters the bloodstream. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And then
So really at the end of the day, there is no way that you're going to slice it, cut it, or whatever. Starch is going to lead to higher glucose, and there's nothing you're going to add to it that is going to make it better. So if you have to have it, enjoy it. Don't lie to yourself that doing something has made it better for you. Just move on and try to do better at the next meal. That's my advice.
Drink water. Yeah. And also, if you're healing insulin resistance in the background, you're able to kind of come down again, right? You're dealing with the cause. So maybe you have better tolerance for those random spikes and you eat your Oreos and you get over it. Done.
And your liver is better able to clear that insulin from the blood. So like one of the studies that influencer likes to use a lot is a study that shows, well, if you add protein and fat to starch and sugar, it leads to lower glucose levels. Well, yes, but in the exact same study, it talks about how insulin levels rose 52% in the same period, right? And part of that was because of increased insulin secretion, and part of that was in decreased insulin clearance. Because when you add the fat and the protein or fat and the starch, the body's like, well, I can't get rid of this glucose or this insulin. I have to have this insulin here because something has to get rid of this glucose. So that's why it increases insulin secretion and prevents the liver from actually getting rid of excess insulin from the blood. So you just have more insulin, right? More insulin means less blood sugar. So, if you read the article, it says that very, very blatantly. Like, I think it was on like the 6th line. It was like, it increases insulin secretion and decreases insulin clearance. And it's like,
but you're an insulin researcher. So you're like, you see it right away, but everyone else is like, that's great. A higher insulin is what we want, right? That's what we do with our drug.
Exactly. I commented on her post like a year ago, or this person's post like over a year ago. And I said something to that effect. I was like, you can't manage glucose and just ignore the insulin. And I think she has some moderators, and one of her moderators said, she's not an insulin expert. She's a glucose expert. And I was like,
okay.
Okay, I have to walk away.
I know everyone knows exactly what we're talking. I mean, there's no reason to not say the name, but it's funny too, because the approach isn't like clinically, when I'm working with people, it's not an easier approach necessarily. Like, I actually had one patient I'm just thinking of who, we got blood work back. She's insulin resistant. I started educating her on what that means. And she's like, you're not going to make me follow this influencer's stuff, are you? Where it's like, fiber before your meal, which is maybe not horrible advice. And like adding, it's like, you're not going to make me follow that, are you? But when I'm recommending the low insulin lifestyle, which I have been doing actually, a lot of people are like happy to receive it. Like there's something very validating about understanding the symptoms, and the diet is very manageable for people. Like kind of psychologically, you can eat what you want. It's logical. It makes sense. It's not like low FODMAP diets. There's certain fruits and vegetables that people don't categorize that you're allowed and you're not allowed. At this one, it's you're allowed all the fruit you want, all the non-starchy vegetables, all the animal protein, your 6 ounces of Greek yogurt or an ounce of cheese, all the fat you want, and avoid sugar. And then you have it's a small blurb that I send people.
Yeah, it's a small little thing. And there's always, you have allulose and monk fruit and all these other things. So you can still have those. I cook with almond flour all the time. I mean, I have tons of stuff with almond flour. I mean, I make Cheez-Its. Like I mix almond flour and egg and some cheddar cheese, and I roll it out and I air fry them. And it's like, so there are so many, and that's part of, what will be on the app. It's just hundreds of recipes, like things like this to really help. And I'm not doing a plug, but I'm just saying I am coming out a guidebook because I feel like the original book is very sciencey, but in a layman's perspective. And if we need to stop, we can. I mean, I'm good. But is this guidebook that's like, if okay, this is a lot of science. I like to know, and it's important to know, but I want to know, like, how do I really incorporate this? And some people want something tangible. So in the next month or so, I'm launching a guidebook, which is like, it really still goes into the details of the studies and the data and the science, but with more pictures, less words, more, recipes, meal plans, how to eat at restaurants, what to do in the holidays, how to build a grocery list, how to read a nutrition label. Like, I mean, just kind of like this more reference guide that's more tangible for people who don't want to use an app. They can have a book, be very colorful. They can set it in their kitchen and like reference whenever they want. So that's, I think will help be helpful too.
It's so good. Yeah. Your Instagram account is great too. You have lots of good recipes. Like, but I think one thing we might have missed is, why is fruit allowed? Because I think people might be wondering that. I don't know if we
Okay.
over that. Yeah.
So fruit is part glucose and part fructose. Now, fructose gets a very bad reputation for good reason. Too much fructose overwhelms the liver, leads to fatty liver, which is like high fructose corn syrup. So fructose in large amounts, really bad. Actually, just a history lesson. One of the reasons why they came out with high fructose corn syrup, aside from it just being very cheap and very sweet, was because it had less glucose. They thought it would be better for diabetics because it wouldn't lead to the same glucose response. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like,
They didn't realize that.
We'll throw this in.
All that
It'll be great. What could go wrong?
It'll be so healthy. And then they were like, oh, this was a problem. They don't care. They still add it to everything. But we know that excess fructose is a problem. Now, whole fruit, go ahead. The good thing about fructose in its naturally occurring form amounts is that it requires zero insulin release for metabolism. So fructose does not elicit any insulin release. So that's, again, why they thought, oh, high fructose corn syrup would be great, but no. So the amount of fructose in a whole raw fruit is not going to overwhelm your liver, right? You have that fiber. It is going to slow that digestion. So you're getting a slow trickle of the fructose instead of just, a soda. So because it's part fructose and because fructose does not elicit any insulin response, fructose as a whole has a lower insulin response. Now, fruit still has glucose, and you still might see something on your CGM or something, but it's still going to be far less than having a whole apple as compared to a third of a cup of quinoa is very different, right? And so, so the amount of glucose in a whole apple is maybe 10 grams. It's like 6 grams of fructose, about 10 grams of glucose, whereas 36 grams, 36 grams in a third of a cup of quinoa. So it's really just thinking about it that perspective, is that fruit doesn't have that huge insulin response because it's part fructose.
Mm-hmm.
And I always like to tell people too, agave nectar is worse than high fructose corn syrup. Agave nectar is 90% fructose. High fructose corn syrup is only 55% fructose. So you're drinking straight fructose when you're having agave nectar. So I just try to tell people, just because it's natural sugar doesn't necessarily mean that it's better for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think one thing that you stress is that there's no limits on fruit, so people are eating as much fruit as they want. Which, when I hear that, I'm like, Dr. Allie, I don't think you know me. Like, maybe you've done research, but maybe you haven't met people like me. Like, I could eat a lot of fruit if you're just going to let me go. But it looked like people were eating about 90 grams of carbs, which is fairly low carb.
Yeah.
And so your desire, kind of.
Your desire goes down. You're like, fruit, I eat fruit every day, but I probably eat like, I don't know, like 2 pieces of fruit, maybe, like sometimes 1, sometimes 2, sometimes more. But again, it's one of those things where you're just full.
Mm-hmm.
You're eating a lot of fiber, you're eating a lot of fat and protein, and you just like, fruit is great, but you're just not as hungry, and you're definitely not as hungry for carbs. So it's just one of those where you still eat them, but it's not one of those like, I want to eat, this whole bowl of fruit. You just have your taste buds and your appetite changes.
Yeah, this is so good. What have you seen beyond 2 months? I don't know if you've tracked people or worked with people or just in personal experience, like, how long does it typically take for people to get their insulin into the normal range? It looked like people's HbA1c was all normalized after 2 months.
Yeah, it was normal to begin with. Yeah.
Sorry, their HOMA IR. HOMA IR was what I wanted to say.
HOMA IR.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like, Yeah, it looked
So
like
we haven't done any studies beyond 8 weeks,
okay.
right? Just 'cause from financially, right? The longer the study it is, the more money. And even the new study, it's called the Lilac study, the Lilli App clinical study. The Lilac study is also 8 weeks because from research, it's hard to like do these. Now,
Yeah.
after the 8 weeks, we will give the participants the ability to say, would you be interested in continuing to follow this and continuing to even just report patient reported outcomes like how their acne has changed. There's some of these very validated like PCOS quality of life surveys that we'll administer once a month just to continue to keep that data, have them self-report their weight once a month. So I'm excited about doing more research. Part of the revenue from our company as a whole will go to continuing to provide more funding for research because I want to do all kinds of, research. But beyond what after 8 weeks, like I have quite a few Instagram influencers. Like one girl, I think she went from like 190 and now she's 135. She's pregnant right now. So, but she's been following me for over a year and a half. And then a personal friend or a family friend of mine, she was 4'11" and 190. And she's now 135 and that's been 2.5 years. And she's been like just steady at 135. And she had a stroke like 10 years ago. And her doctor now took her off all of her meds
Wow.
because her blood levels and everything are normal. So it is sustainable because it teaches you to think about food in a different way. You're not thinking about of calories and I need to eat more. I need to exercise to burn off something. It's thinking of it in a different way. And I've plenty of people that are like, I've lost so much weight. I got rid of all of my fat clothes because I have no concern that I'm ever going to keep it off. Like I have no issue. Or others will say, I'll go on vacation and like, I'll do whatever I want, but it's okay because I come home and I get right back on it. And the water weight that I've gained is off in a week, and I'm right back to my normal. So it's like, you can still enjoy your life,
Mhm.
and have those moments where you can just eat what you want, as long as you know what your default is.
Mhm.
You're going to come home and you're going to get back on your default and you're going to give your pancreas a break from the damage you just, I don't want to say damage, from the enjoyment that you've had. And then you're going to go back and you're going to give your pancreas a break. So I have what's called a bounce back blueprint. And I put in that it's like, you're going to wake up, you're going to drink a bunch of water, you're going to go for a long walk, like how to get back into, all right, I'm going to get back into my.
That's good. Yeah, it's good from kind of like a binge eating perspective, right? It's like, okay, no all or nothing thinking, just get back on it. And you're not, I think you've talked about the keto diet, and this is because you're eating carbs and you're just getting your carbs from fruit and vegetables. You're not like going on vacation, getting out of ketosis, then having to switch back in, going through that whole metabolic process. Like you're just,
2 weeks. Yeah.
yeah, you're just, okay, I'm just probably going to eat a lot of bananas the first day until everything regulates. And then my appetite will settle and I'm not having to like metabolically switch in that way that, can cause side effects for people, or this idea of like you're either in it or
Well,
out of it. Mhm.
because ketosis is, I mean, keto basically lowers insulin. That's what it's doing. It's just doing it in a very aggressive way.
Mhm.
And when your insulin lowers that low and you don't have any glucose that you're eating, your body has no choice but to switch over and burn only fat, which is what is releasing those ketones and what your body is using. But that leads to that keto flu, because until your insulin level is lower enough to where you can burn that body fat, your brain is like I don't have anything here. Like I don't have enough glucose. I don't have enough fat to use because your insulin's too high. You really have to wait until you get to that switch where you can lower insulin and you can start burning all that body fat. But here is this more of a middle ground, because your insulin levels are lowering, but you still have some glucose that you're eating from the fruits and the vegetables. So it's more of like what's called metabolically flexible.
Mm.
You're able to burn glucose when you need to, and then your insulin levels fall, and then you can burn some body fat, and then you eat again, and you can burn some glucose, and then you can burn some body fat. Your body is, and that's a term, like that's an actual term, metabolic flexibility, that you are flexible and that you can burn whatever it is that you need. Most people can't do that, right? Most people can't burn body fat, can't burn fat for energy. And then keto, it's just a very aggressive way of lowering insulin and wanting to just never have glucose. Well, you don't really have to do that, right? Like you can there is a middle ground.
Yeah, which is so refreshing to see, and like,
Yeah.
it's well received. Like people love it. Like, oh, I can have as much fruit. Okay. Because we're told often that fruit is bad and everything is confusing, you know?
Because it's glucose, right? They think, oh, if carbs are bad, carbs are bad.
Yeah.
Like, think of it more of like how it's affecting your metabolism,
Mhm.
right? And how you're, and people think of metabolism as just like how many calories you burn every day. No, no. Metabolism means how you use the food that you eat for energy or store it as fat. And if you're eating foods that are constantly forcing insulin release, then you're storing it as fat. That's just what's happening. So, um, and eating big breakfast to boost your metabolism, that
Mhm.
eat when you want. If you're not a breakfast person, don't eat breakfast, right? Like this is getting rid of every single food rule. There is one rule. If it spikes your insulin, you should avoid it as much as you can. If it doesn't spike your insulin, eat it whenever you want. you know, there is one rule, and that really, it makes people feel refreshed. Like the amount of brain space that I don't spend on food
Mm.
because and for 10 plus years, the amount of time I spent worried about food and calories and carbs and working out and protein and everything else, like, it's just like, free up your brain for other things in life that bring you joy. That's really, I think, the most important thing.
Yeah, I can relate to that so much, and even the being a sugar burner, like being metabolically inflexible. When I first learned about it, I was like, yeah, that's me. Every 2 hours I need to eat. And it feels like you're not, especially if you are a calorie, like I was a calorie tracker for a while, and I'd be like, how am I burnt? Like, if this has 500 calories, why am I hungry? Based on this whole calories in, calories out, all the biochemistry that you learn, like I should be full for, I don't know, longer than 2 hours. I'm not burning 500 calories sitting here and studying. Um, and so when I learned about that, I was like, oh yeah, I'm not accessing the fat from my food or my body. I'm just running
Mhm.
on sugar. It's like a car with a race car engine or something. I'm like burning all the gas out and having to refuel constantly. And it's
And
maddening
this is
that.
9 out of 10 adults.
Yeah.
I think it's like 4 out of 10 kids. They did a study. You could test the insulin levels of a 5-year-old right now, and it will tell you whether they're going to be overweight, have type early diabetes. A 5-year-old. I
Mm,
mean, they did finger pricks at school for like thousands of kids, and they measured them. They followed them over the course of like, I think, 10 or years or so, and they said the number one strongest predictor of early, adolescent obesity was elevated fasting insulin at age 5. And
mm, it's so
so
sad. It's so
it
sad.
is. There's so much to be done. And I will say, people are gonna be like, well, why are people not talking about this? Why are doctors not talking about this? Why aren't you measuring it? I can tell you in one very simple way. Because the only time that clinical guidelines actually change
Mm,
is when somebody foots the bill, and it's usually big pharma.
mm,
So when big pharma came out with cholesterol lowering drugs, they had the teams that worked with the clinical societies. They worked with the insurance companies. They worked on developing the standard ranges so that because they had a solution to a problem that they needed to make sure that everybody understood the problem so they would buy the solution.
mhm,
Unfortunately, there is no drug in development for lowering insulin levels. And so because of that, there is nobody footing the bill for increasing access to this information, to making sure that we have standard ranges, to make sure the insurance companies are reimbursing for this. I mean, it takes deep pockets to do that. And the only people who have pockets deep enough are big pharma. And there's no drug on the horizon to lower insulin. And that is the reason, because they have huge field forces to go out and educate every single doctor about, you need to measure this and why, and look at our data. And this is so important. And look at the outcomes for people who there's nobody doing that.
yeah. It was a whole task force around fat, cholesterol. It was like decades
Yes.
of people all getting together and deciding on these guidelines. And
Yes.
and that
And there's,
I'm just thinking about the kid with high insulin who, let's say the parents are like, okay, we're going to put some effort in and we're going to look at your diet and we're going to follow the guidelines. We're going to pay attention to labels, and we're going to probably be eating our six
we're going to eat whole grain.
of
Oh,
greens. Yeah. Which, so it's like we take our effort and our best intentions, and then we're not applying the right interventions.
Right.
And
it's
people give up, you know?
yes. And then they're like, but whole grains are good for you. I'm not saying that
Mm.
they don't have nutrition. That doesn't mean they're good for somebody with glucose intolerance, which is essentially almost everyone. So, yeah, they think that they have the best intentions. They go to the store, they buy the whole grain goldfish instead of the regular goldfish, and they buy the protein Special K because it has more protein and low calories, and they mix it with the low fat skim milk. And literally every single one of those choices could not put more insulin into the system. I mean, it is literally flooding it.
Mm.
And it's like there's another dietitian influencer on Instagram, and she basically was like, if your kid is struggling and if they want to have KFC and they want to eat the biscuits, you just need to make sure that you give them the chicken leg with the biscuit, because the chicken leg gives you the protein and the fat. And so that'll offset the biscuit. I mean, this is a dietitian. She's hundreds of thousands of followers. And it's just maddening. It's maddening. And so, and I feel like nobody can win for losing, because they're like, I'm following all this advice and my kid's getting worse, or, and it's just stuff.
Yeah.
I really
feel like it doesn't work, or I'm broken.
Doesn't work. Or
yeah.
I made a post recently that we go to conferences, we go to the big like the big fertility conference and whatnot. And I've had many doctors tell me, fertility specialists tell me, I don't send my PCOS patients to dietitians anymore because they come back worse than they started.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they get told eat more whole grains and beans and low fat dairy, and then they come back and they're heavier than they started.
Yeah, I have a patient I'm thinking of with prediabetes who's already on like max out in the metformin dose, and her dietitian is like, okay, when your blood sugar drops, because you're on metformin and you're not diabetic, so your blood sugar is going too low, and it's metformin is lowering blood sugar. It is lowering insulin a little bit, but not enough. And it's like, just have a candy. Take candies with you and have candies to bring your blood sugar up.
Granola bar. Eat your granola bar. Like, oh my God.
Terrible. So it's just, and even she was like, this isn't working. I feel like trash. Like, I'm not going to go anymore.
Dietitians do not understand insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
It's not taught in school. I mean, I graduated from my bachelor's in 2009. So that was a long time ago. And I was really hopeful that they'd at least caught up with the data. But I have another follower who's currently getting her bachelor's in nutrition. She's like, the only thing I've learned about insulin is that you give it to diabetics to lower their blood sugar, and that's it. Like, they do not learn about this. So if everything looks like a hammer, or if all you have is a hammer and everything looks like a nail, everyone's getting the same advice.
Yeah.
And
terrible. It's
you can tell I'm very passionate about this topic.
This is so good. This is so informative. I think people are really going to love this. My last question is, about men. So I know your research is PCOS. We're talking more broadly about insulin resistance. I think what's really beautiful about your research is that it's done on women, because so much is not done on women at all. And so conventional advice like intermittent fasting, cold therapy, all this stuff that's so great and influencers are recommending may not be great for women who have different hormones, different considerations. But these are results done on women. And everybody who's done a diet with their male partner knows, like, he loses like 50 pounds, I lose 1,
Yeah.
But my friend wanted to know if this applies to men, which I think the answer is obvious, but yeah.
I mean, it applies to everyone, right? Kids, pregnant women, men, everyone. Because for men, one of the bigger issues is around the age 35, they start to have a reduction in testosterone, right? Let's call it menopause. They start to have a reduction in testosterone just naturally, which coincides with an increase in insulin. So a lot of times they'll see that they're having dad bod, which may not be anything to do with what they are changed in their eating or exercise. But when you have higher insulin, you start to gain weight, and a large part of that goes to your stomach. And more so, that's even more problematic with that is that when you have more fat tissue, that fat tissue has an enzyme called aromatase. And what happens is testosterone gets converted to estrogen into that fat tissue. So now not only do you have this natural decline in testosterone, but now whatever testosterone is left and being pumped out is getting turned into estrogen, right? So you have that's what's causing men to have low testosterone. And the only therapy we're giving is to do testosterone injections or testosterone replacement therapy, but you're not getting to the real reason why they have the low testosterone in the first place. So that's one of the problems, but that also leads to erectile dysfunction because now you have more chronic inflammation, which inflames, all of your vascular system. But also, having lower testosterone. So all of that kind of compounds to lead to erectile dysfunction, which is one of the earliest symptoms of insulin resistance in men. I had no idea a third of men experience erectile dysfunction. That is a very early sign of problems. Before they have anything wrong with their labs, before anything happens, if they're experiencing erectile dysfunction at an early age, it's not just psychological. There is definitely something wrong going on. So that's something I would say if you're having a husband that's experiencing that, they need to probably go get a workup. But, the other thing is like sperm. High insulin and that chronic inflammation leads to changes in the sperm. So, if you're trying to get pregnant, you need to be following it, but so does he. He needs to have the healthiest sperm he can have. And that starts with lowering insulin, making sure there's not enough testosterone, making sure there's not chronic inflammation. So I shared earlier, my husband, he's part Hispanic. His dad died of a massive heart attack at the age of 41. And he was about 200 pounds when we started dating. He's 5'11". And he has now, that's been 12 years since we started dating. And he's at 175 and has stayed at 175, like completely. And he's not perfect. I told you that he doesn't realize you can eat a pint of ice cream in different settings. Like he just eats the whole thing. So he's not perfect, but he is very, very, if he goes up a little bit, he stays strict for like a few weeks and he's back down and it's just, very even keel. And I will say, there was a study in 1966. So back in 1966, where they said fasting insulin is the strongest predictor of heart disease. Strongest predictor of heart disease in the Lancet in 1966. So he went to his cardiologist like 2 months ago because I told him, I was like, you know what? I don't care that you look healthy. You obviously have genetic history. You need to go and start getting workup with your cardiologist. He's 38. And he went and he asked his cardiologist, to test his insulin levels. And she literally said, I don't think you can test insulin.
Wow.
And he was like, yeah, I know you can test insulin. She goes, I don't know how to do that. I'm going to have to go talk to my colleagues.
In 1966, so right before the low-fat cholesterol kind of paradigm.
Everything we have known for decades on decades that insulin is a problem. And yet here we are in 2025 and we're not measuring it. And their excuse is that, well, the assays aren't predictable. Then develop a better assay. That's not the answer, is to just be like, well, we can't measure it. Yeah. What?
There's developments for type 1 diabetes, so they must have figured out how to, we can isolate insulin, we can make the peptide, we can inject it in people, we have we have all kinds of insulin.
We know how to do. Yeah. You can pee on a pregnancy test and it will measure a certain small hormone in your blood in a few seconds. And you're saying we can't develop assays for insulin? It's mind-blowing. But I think personally, it's probably a little bit of a conspiracy, because if we start managing the insulin, then how are we going to treat the cancer? And who's going to make money on treating the cancer and the Alzheimer's and the diabetes and the weight loss?
Like all of our health issues go away.
The testosterone replacements. All of the healthcare would go away.
Yeah. Everybody's talking about cardiometabolic, like this idea of metabolic health, metabolic disease. And this is exactly what you're working with. And I was just listening to Andrew Huberman. I know we're almost at our time, but he's talking about, he's like, a lot of my friends follow this really great diet. And he was describing your diet. I don't think he knew about your diet. Hopefully he will one day. But he was like, yeah, lots of fruits and vegetables and proteins from animals. And they feel great and everything's great. And their cravings are managed. And so we all intuitively know that's the way to eat plants and animals, less processed food.
And nuts and seeds and like things that are just normally available. Like, people don't realize how the amount. I think I used AI because I said, okay, imagine that all of human evolution was 1 year. How long have we been eating starches and dairy? If you were to do that, what would your guess be? If all of human evolution was compacted into 1 year, how long do you think we have actually as a species been eating starch or dairy?
I have a little bit of knowledge in like the 12-hour clock. It's like the last second or something like that. So I imagine it'd be like the last month.
2.5 seconds.
Yeah. Oh,
In
wow. Okay. In a year.
evolution, we've been eating, we have been eating starches and dairy for 2.5 seconds. And so when people are like, we have been eating bread from the beginning of history, I'm like, no.
And it was
No,
different bread, and we had different like
with different bread, and we also didn't
Yeah.
eat bread. We ate bread when we became societies, and we didn't want to have to look for our next food. And that makes sense, and that's great. We built societies, but we also worked. We exercised a lot more. We were just active, right? Like we were going out and gathering that
bad
by
teeth
hand.
around that time. We had like bad bone structure. Like things changed. Not it's full of these diseases ran rampant and
Right. Like
so
there is nothing that's naturally available to us that spikes insulin. Fruits, people are like, oh, well, like, the fruits today are so big, they're not the same. Well, have you ever seen a fruit tree that's like heavy with fruit? If you were like a hunter gatherer or like an ancient person and you just happened upon this fruit tree, you might sit there and eat 3 or 4 apples. Like, who cares if an apple today is this big when you just would eat like several of them, like that's, and they're like, oh, well, they're sweeter. I'm like, no. I spent two weeks in the Amazon when I was 18, and that fruit is unadulterated and is sweeter than I've ever tasted in a grocery store. So it's not because it's sweeter. It doesn't matter that it's bigger. Fruit has always been very available. I live in the coast. The orange trees here get so full of oranges that the branches touch the ground. I mean, fruit would have always been available to us. Vegetables would have always been available to us. Like my parents are drowning in pecans. We live in Texas. I mean, the amount of pecans, they have 6 pecan trees in their house. Like these are foods that would have just been available to us, and it's like going and gathering enough oats to make your morning bowl of oatmeal that you cooked in the microwave for 90 seconds and added milk and honey to.
You don't know even how to do that. Like you know how to pick an apple. You can theoretically imagine how you kill an animal, but how you make oats, even what an oat looks like when it's growing, nobody knows, right?
No, and it would have just been wild oats, right? Like you would have had to go forever to find enough oats to like put in your bowl and then somehow make it. I mean, steel cut oats take forever to cook, and just it wouldn't have been part of our life. And now people think nothing of a bowl of granola and skim milk, which is just oats and sugar and milk, or a bowl of oatmeal with milk and honey in it. And they're like, oh, it's oatmeal. It's like, it's so much more than oatmeal. It's a bowl of glucose, and it's hard for people to get their head wrapped. But hopefully with this conversation, they understand a little bit more behind what's going on.
Yeah, I think minds will be blown. So really why I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to be like, listen to this conversation of patients who are like, what? Like, but Dr. Ali, any last thoughts, any last words? Thank you so much.
No, I think that, I think we covered everything and more. People might need to watch this on 2X to get
Yeah, watch it a couple times. I might record another episode kind of going over the signs with PowerPoint to kind of like reinforce what we talked about. But yeah, this is really great.
Yeah, I think the free webinar, right? That free webinar I have on YouTube, I think it really helps also just, put some perspective. I have a free guide on my website with kind of all the foods that you can eat freely of. And then, so, and I have the app coming out. It'll have tons of free education. It'll have a subscription because that's just, part of the world we live in. But if you want to access some of the tools and resources, but a lot of the education will be free. So, yeah.
Perfect. I'll link to everything in the show notes for people to check you out and to follow you. So your website and your Instagram. Is that the best place people can find you? Kind of website?
I think I'm not very active on any other social platform. I can only handle one. But Instagram is where I'm at. Yeah. Where I do the most.
Thank you so much. This has been so great.
Thank you for having me. Love it.